In Washington, lawmakers gathered at the Capitol to commemorate the 6 million Jews who were murdered and other victims of Nazi persecution. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries encouraged people to never, ever forget.
Did you know that federal law in the U.S. mandates the remembrance of the Holocaust? The United States established Days of Remembrance to educate and honor its victims. In stark contrast, there is no similar national mandate for memorializing slavery. It's time to find out why.
During the Holocaust, Jews were isolated, dehumanized, and abandoned, while others stood by. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. It's important that we continue to take a side.
After that, for Mr. Jeffries, House Speaker Mike Johnson then announced the Congressional Gold Medal will be awarded posthumously to Benjamin Ferencz. If you don't know the name, he was a prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials conducted to bring Nazi officials to justice after World War II.
Yes, federal law in the United States mandates the remembrance of this event. This is a law. It's called the Annual Days of Remembrance, and it supports education through the bipartisan Never Again Education Act of 2020, which funds teacher training through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. This highlights the differences in how these significant historical events are recognized and remembered across the nation. Over 29 states mandate Holocaust education in schools. The question we certainly should be asking is, why is there a federal law in the United States to remember horrific crimes committed against those harmed in another country, but we do not have a similar law to remember those who were harmed here? So we see that the fight for the acknowledgement of Negro identities and histories is deeply intertwined with systemic racism, and this imbalance highlights social preferences that elevate certain stories of pain and suffering while excluding others, which leads to selective remembrance.
Arkansas paid tribute with a major legislative milestone.
5 News reporter Zoe Henry was there and spoke with key supporters that push to have Holocaust education be a staple to Arkansas school curriculums.
I had a dream.
Holocaust survivor Peter says the Holocaust Remembrance Day all started with that dream. The law requires for students to learn about the Holocaust.
Mandating Holocaust education in Arkansas public schools for 5th through 12th graders.
The bill became law a year ago with unanimous approval in the House and Senate. And today, the university paid tribute to that victory against anti-Semitism, dedicating the pen Governor Hutchinson used to sign the bill into law. While the pen played a role, there was more to talk about.
The saying goes, if we do not learn about the past, we are bound to repeat it.
I absolutely agree. So why is there a war on truth when it comes to our history?
Now that the bill is law, the group that helped write it is pushing for teachers to create specific curriculums.
And that brings us back to this topic. the recent vote held at the UN declaring the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity. Based on the information I just covered, you need to understand why the vote was so significant. Let's look at some information from Juris News. The article says UN General Assembly adopted a historic resolution on March 25th declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. That word right there is key. The United States took issue with that word. They didn't want it to say that it was the gravest crime against humanity, because according to this administration, it creates a hierarchy of crimes against humanity. Let's take a look at that and we'll come back to this. This comes from the Grio. It says the Trump administration made several arguments against the UN resolution. One of them is that it claims that the text created a hierarchy of crimes against humanity. Other countries that abstained from the resolution made a similar argument. The assertion that some crimes against humanity are less severe than others objectively diminishes the suffering of countless victims and survivors of other atrocities throughout history. So this is what America is saying. You shouldn't rank the suffering of people as one being more severe than the other. They said this is not a competition. This attempted ranking is also simply incorrect as a matter of law, said Ambassador Negria. So the author of this article said no such arguments were made when adopting definitions of anti-Semitism. The author says somehow saying the centuries-long practice of human trafficking of a specific race of people and the enslavement of these people and their descendants for generations could not be considered the gravest crime against humanity. Just look at the duration of this and the sheer number of people impacted. It's countless, and that is key. Let's go back to the Juris News article. It says the resolution was adopted to commemorate the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This International Day of Remembrance is a day set aside to annually educate and reflect on slavery. So if the United States saw fit to enact a law to remember the Holocaust, why shouldn't there be a day of remembrance for the victims of slavery? And yes, it should be an international day of remembrance. Of course, we know that much more is needed to atone for the crimes committed against our people, and that day will come. Based on Scripture, that day of reaping is at hand. The United States, Israel, and Argentina opposed this resolution, and all of the European Union bloc abstained, to include Canada, Australia, and Japan. This needed to be a matter of record, you all. Let's go on. So here is why they say they're against the resolution. They don't think it's right for reparations to be paid for crimes that were committed in the 1800s. They don't think it should be legal to make them pay in the 21st century based on the principle of intertemporality that was put forward in the Island of Palmas case. The principle establishes that the legality of an act must be assessed considering laws that existed at the time the act occurred. In contrast, the continuous validity of the act is assessed under evolving legal norms. In essence, because slavery was not illegal under the international law at the time it occurred, it would be wrong to demand reparations because that's not in the interest of justice. Are we really going to talk about justice, considering how unjust slavery was? So the counter argument says that the international law principle of jus cogens transcends time, and that is an important fact. It means that slavery is inherently unlawful regardless of whether it was normalized in past centuries. Now that they have passed this ruling saying that it was the gravest crime committed against humanity, this principle of jus cogens can be used to force payment. So the case being made is that slavery was not prohibited under international law at the time, but Braco Powers, and this is a Ghanaian lawyer and constitutional law analyst expert, he's saying that this claim ignores the nature of preemptory norms and the evolution of international legal conscience. Let me give you an example. Folks fought against abortion in the United States for how long, even though it was legal? It was a Republican talking point. For how long? They fought against it for religious and moral reasons. So on that issue, they didn't care that it was legal. They felt compelled to push back because they believed it was wrong. They could not ignore their conscience. So this lawyer is saying slavery and the slave trade are not recognized as peremptory norms, jus cogens, from which no derogation is permitted because they violate fundamental rights. These norms are considered binding on all states regardless of treaties or historical context. Even if the lexicon of contemporary criminal law, as in a crime against humanity, did not exist in the European 18th century, the underlying prohibition against treating human beings as property was already a moral and legal imperative. The very concept of human rights, as later codified in instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is premised on the recognition that certain wrongs are intolerable anywhere, regardless of historical timing. This says international law did not invent morality. It formalized shared human values. And this is why European colonizers fought so hard to label our people as animals. Remember the saying, a black man has no rights that a white man has to respect? So they are fighting on the grounds of jus cogens and saying the absence of a treaty in 1750 saying slave trade or slave trading is illegal does not negate the inherent injustice of enslaving human beings, and it does not invalidate the legal and moral claims of their descendants today. So the Jurist News article says concerns of African rulers in the slave trade raises questions on whether reparation to African states would be just. My response is all of those who benefited need to pay the descendants, period. It goes on to say that condemning the unfortunate humiliations of the victims of slavery, the minority leader of the Ghana House of Parliament stated that reparations are not necessary as the black man himself maltreated his fellow, given chance to the white man to do the same. What a nincompoop. So excuse the wrong because the black man participated? No. Prohibition of theft is in Scripture. Refer to Exodus 22:4. A thief had to repay double the stolen amount plus the cost of replacing the item. So the UN resolution explicitly links recognition of the slave trade to reparatory justice. It urges member states to consider formal apologies, restitution, and compensation, including the return of cultural artifacts and support for education, infrastructure and economic development in African countries and the diaspora. Now, although the resolution is not legally binding, it carries significant moral and political weight, reinforcing the legitimacy of reparations claims and providing a framework for voluntary engagement by states and international institutions. We can already see which nations will oppose paying restitution, but the Most High has already declared that they will pay, and they will pay more than they ever imagined. This article from The Guardian says the United Nations has voted to describe the transatlantic chattel slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity and called for reparations as a concrete step towards remedying historical wrongs. The UK said it recognized the gravity of the issues addressed in the resolution and the untold harm and misery the transatlantic slave trade had inflicted on millions of people over many decades. But they say they firmly disagree with fundamental propositions of the text and was firmly of the view that we must not create a hierarchy of historical atrocities. Well, can you think of something that was much worse? Let's talk about that. They can't. So it says no single set of atrocities should be regarded as more or less significant than another. The British MP presented a petition to the House of Commons pushing for a state apology instead. No. And my question is, why now? They've had many opportunities to issue a formal apology and they refuse. But now they think, well, we'll just say sorry, and that's the way to get around doing what is right. No, that's not going to work. This says so many of the intersecting global challenges we now face are rooted in the legacies of enslavement and empire. From geopolitical instability to racism, inequality, underdevelopment, and climate breakdown, the petition read, to truly confront these issues, we must acknowledge where they come from. Yes, acknowledge it, and then you pay for it. It says, for 4 centuries, 7 European nations, including the UK, enslaved and trafficked more than 15 million Africans across the Atlantic. The scale of the chattel slavery was such that 18th and 19th century abolitionists coined the term crime against humanity to describe it. Historians have also linked wealth from enslavement to mass industrialization in the West. When it's framed as a trade, it distorts the reality, said Jasmine Mickens, a postgraduate student of history and government at Harvard University. It was not a consensual joint business enterprise. In recent years, the AU has been working to ensure the codifying of chattel slavery as a crime that requires not just apologies, but reparatory justice. Right now, the focus is on this particular moment and recognizing that it is a culmination of many moments before this day, Mickens said. What people don't seem to remember, due to all the efforts to erase history, is that Black people, African people, have resisted the institution of chattel enslavement and the trafficking of Africans since the first hour the crime was committed on the shores of Africa. So Mahama is talking about the continued efforts to erase Black history in the United States through increasing censorship of teaching the truth of slavery, segregation, and racism in schools. It says these policies are becoming a template for other governments and some private institutions, he said, at an event at the UN headquarters. At the very least, they are slowly normalizing the erasure. So this resolution created a legal framework under international law, basically saying while slavery was not illegal under international law at the time it occurred, the principle of jus cogens establishes that such acts are inherently unlawful, allowing contemporary legal and moral claims to be made. This framing also opens the door to discussions of genocide as the systematic targeting, abduction, and dehumanization of millions of Africans, and it meets criteria for crimes against humanity and could be interpreted under broader definitions of genocidal acts. Now we're going to look at why this UN declaration matters and tie it into the impending judgment of the nations that benefited. This comes from Jamaica Observer. This says, during the 1800s, slavery changed form. It became tied to European imperialism. Powerful nations such as Britain and France took over land in Africa and other regions. The countries that had been major slave traders became the leading imperial powers in Africa. For example, French forces in the late 1800s still captured people and forced them into service. Laws in French West Africa didn't truly end slavery. They simply allowed colonial governments to take over land. Do you see that the reason they gave for doing it was a lie? And we already covered the primary reason in previous sessions. They said it had to do with black skin being a curse. However, the first humans were copper colored, and so were the ancient Israelites. So this lie began with twisted theology about the curse of Ham. But we see that Ham wasn't the only one with dark melanated skin. Another lie had to do with bringing civilization to those with melanated skin. And let's not forget that they used that one on the Native Americans as well. This says, the colonizing countries often claimed they were bringing civilization. Similarly, European colonizers in Central Africa, especially under Belgian rule in the Congo Free State, caused massive suffering and death. Around 10 million people died over about 40 years. This says, over the course of transatlantic slaving, Africans participated, resisted, adapted, and preserved cultural and intellectual systems that would later shape diaspora communities and their bonds with Africa. Recent calls for reparatory justice emerged from this long-standing network of connections. Ghana's resolution comes out of a convergence of continental and diaspora political efforts. African states and Caribbean nations have increasingly coordinated their positions on historical injustice and reparation. So the argument being used that it's too late to call for compensation ignores the fact that demands for restitution didn't just begin. No, the guilty parties derailed past efforts to fight against their oppressive systems, and they ignored the cries for justice. They successfully kept Africa divided and used mercenary groups to stir up insurrections and forced migrations. Let's also remember that this is not just about those who were trafficked here. Our people were trafficked around the world. Divide and conquer. So this says the Abuja Proclamation of 1993 formally recognized that a moral debt is owed to the peoples of Africa for slavery and colonization. This says the Ghana Declaration sets a precedent. It seeks to redefine the moral language of the international order. Elevating it as the gravest crime underscores slavery's scale and duration. Its systemic nature establishes it as the fundamental architect of global capitalism, racial hierarchies, and modern state formation. The Ghana Declaration recognizes the centrality of transatlantic slavery and compels a reassessment of how modern inequalities are explained and addressed. You all, this is not just about natural laws, though. This is also a spiritual issue. And we can look at the comparison between what happened to us and what happened to our ancestors in Egypt. Without a doubt, Pharaoh made decrees regarding the enslavement and mistreatment of our people. It went on for centuries, and the Israelites had to endure the atrocities. But the Most High took note of the suffering, and he heard their groans. And they would have continued on with it if the Most High had not intervened. So we have a just case, and our oppressors cannot escape the judgment that they are due. The Egyptians went through various plagues before the children of Israel were delivered. It was not an overnight thing. Each plague lasted long enough for its effects to be felt by the Egyptians. The bloodline families are fully aware of what is happening. They're stirring up the hatred of the descendants of those who carried out brutal attacks against our people during the days of slavery and Jim Crow. They're desperate, so they lash out against us. They're being manipulated by those who control the wealth. And what's the tool they use? The lie about white supremacy. But Gentiles who have a sincere desire to do what is right will not escape either, because they are a hindrance to the implementation of the beast system. You either join them or you will face their wrath. So it should not be a surprise to anyone that they want an uprising. They want a race war, order out of chaos. But the order they want to bring about ushers in the control of the beast. Let's just look at some snapshots of headline news, and it will tell you that our oppressors can see the writing on the wall. They know that the curses are reversing. This comes from Reuters. It says, the European Union risks a sad, bad future. International politics is asking this question: will Europe fail? It says, for the first time, the end of the EU is a realistic scenario. The foundations of integration are crumbling while centrifugal forces are reinforcing the disintegration. One thing that we can point to that they want to overlook and make it about everything else is live births per woman. This says the fertility rates for the European bloc have been declining, with the total fertility rate in the EU at 1.34 live births per woman in 2024. This rate is the lowest since 2001 and reflects a significant shift in the demographic trends across Europe. The decline in fertility rates is attributed to various factors, so this is what they want to say it's about: education, contraception, changing societal norms. It says the EU fertility rate has been below the replacement level of 2.1 live births per woman since the mid-1970s, and this trend is expected to continue, leading to population changes and demographic shifts in the coming decades. This article from Resilience says the U.S. is broken. It's time to think about what comes next. Age of transformation. This says the U.S. is collapsing like the USSR. So what comes next? We are facing the end of the West. Some of our best science shows the U.S. empire is following the collapse path of the USSR. But this is also the precursor to the emergence of a new life cycle for civilization. U.S. News and World Report is talking about Recession 2026, what to watch and how to prepare, but there are some who say it's already here. The Nation magazine says the United States is self-destructing amid empire collapse, as its dangerously wrong priorities will accelerate America's decline. And Heinrich Ball-Siftung says the European Union is not merely facing a series of overlapping crises, but the simultaneous unraveling of the geopolitical, economic, and democratic orders that have long underpinned its stability and global role. This poses a stark question. Can Europe move from being an object of global shifts to becoming a subject that actively shapes the emerging world order? That's what the fight is about. They're jockeying for the top positions in the new world order. Change is coming, family. The prophecies have already declared that we will be delivered from the hands of our enemies, and they will be forced to pay for what they have done. Gentiles need to pick a side and do it quickly, because when our deliverer comes, he will be bringing a reward for his people and those who love him, and his wrath will be upon all of the nations involved in oppressing us. We will end it there. Hopefully this message has been a blessing to you. Help us share it to all who need to hear. You can also like, hype, and subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.